comedy at the end of the day is connecting with the audience, So even if it's something uncomfortable, it's because you spoke some truth that was funny.
You performed in China just before the hammer came down on comedy. What was that like, and why does China see comedy as dangerous?
I think China finds comedy really threatening because it is kind of the ultimate form of free speech.
Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Tomasz Koper, sitting in for Divya Gopalan. Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un walk into a bar. The bartender says in a bucket. This is what you might see if you lived in a country like China, Russia or North Korea, all of which are well known for censoring all forms of media. In May last year, China began cracking down on stand-up comedy. This came after citizens took offense at a joke made by the comedian known as House, in which he referenced the People's Liberation Army. The Chinese government then began policing comedy performances by reviewing videos and scripts, which comedians now have to submit in advance. But many would argue that censorship happens not just under authoritarian regimes. To better understand why comedy is under attack in some countries and the role of social opinion in censorship and cancel culture, we're joined by American comedian Atsuko Okatsuka in Los Angeles, and joining us from Taipei we have Vickie Wang, a Taiwanese comedian who performed in China before the crackdown. Thank you both for joining us. Vickie, like I mentioned, you performed in China just before the hammer came down on comedy. What was that like, and why does China see comedy as dangerous?
Yeah, I was doing comedy in Shanghai for about 4 years before things got really tense. I think China finds comedy really threatening because it is kind of the ultimate form of free speech. Anyone can sign up at open mic and get 5 minutes and say whatever they want to say. Now, performers who perform in China obviously understand very early on that there are some definite red lines that you're not supposed to cross, like the 3 T's, like Tiananmen Square, Tibet, Taiwan. But overall, because it's such a free form performance art, it's not very easy to restrict.
And Atsuko, I understand that you recently performed in Hong Kong and Singapore during your Asia tour, and I know that you had to submit your scripts beforehand. Did you run into any problems with that?
Yeah, I actually didn't. There were some, especially when it came to like queer rights. I think that's what they were concerned about. I talk about having a cousin who is gay and, being for queer rights. But the thing I realized was that I think these rules are more to, oppress the locals and sort of the privileged position I was in, being like a foreigner coming in, sort of this international comedian coming in, because I get to leave. And also, I don't think they want to cause a fuss. They don't want me coming back to the United States being like, they didn't let me do my script. They didn't let me do my hour, my jokes as written, I think. So I did have to submit a script. It was like an extra process that I had to do. But yeah, I saw the disparity of like, oh, I'm luckier than if I were a comedian living there,
Vickie, how does the situation in China and other countries that might be more restrictive when it comes to comedy compare to Taiwan?
Oh, things are very comfortable in Taiwan. We still have freedom of press. We still have free speech. Open mics here are completely open to anyone who wants to join, and there are no rules. You don't even have to be funny. You just have to have something to say. Whereas in China, in order to protect a community, and the community that does do stand-up comedy in China is relatively small, you tell yourself, you self-censor before you even have to submit a script to make sure that the community would be protected from the regulators.
And Atsuko, how does a government looking over your shoulder, looking over comedians' shoulders, like what we're seeing in China, how does that affect the local comedy scene?
Gosh, I mean, I haven't super gotten to hang out with local comedians in like Hong Kong or Singapore as much, but a couple of them are moving out. So I guess that is one thing. Um, Based on what Vickie said, though, I had an idea. Maybe it is a good idea for like comedians in China to purposely just do so bad, just be so not funny that they're distracted by that. Maybe make that the sin, you know? Like the comedy is so bad. Like, oh, maybe we miss like, you know, the good comedians that we canceled or something like that. Anyway, that's a pitch. If anyone has China's number.
Well, they can come to Taiwan where, as Vickie said, you don't even have to be funny, so they will make me look better.
Oh, trust me, you don't have to be funny in America either.
I picked the right country, I guess. Sometimes censorship can be a reflection of preference or beliefs rather than policy. We spoke to comedian and writer Titi Lee about their experience with content restrictions. Take a listen.
There was one time I did a school, and I'm not going to say the name, but I'm going to say it was a religious university. They knew what they were getting with me. I very open about my sexuality. It's a big part of my comedy. And 5 minutes before I went on stage, I was in the green room, and one of the student organizers came up to me and said, "Oh, by the way, you can't talk about the issue of gay marriage." And that really threw me off guard because I'm aware of like content restrictions and being aware of like, you know, university's guidelines, but not only was it right before on stage, it was also the wording, like the issue of gay marriage. I was like, well, I can talk about being bisexual, which I am. I can talk about dating. I can talk about marrying a man, I guess. I can talk about divorcing a woman maybe, but I can't talk about the issue of gay marriage. And so that is what I did. I ended up hinting at it in my set and mentioning that, you know, I date men and women. I'm not yet married, and just really driving that in. And it actually ended up going better with the audience.
You can find the full version of our interview with Titi Lee on our YouTube channel or the TaiwanPlus website. So Vickie, does this happen in Taiwan? Do venues or event organizers ask performers to avoid certain topics, do's and don'ts, that kind of stuff?
Oh, I've never encountered that in Taiwan. Yeah, I think venues here just hope that you're funny. I do sometimes. The issue in Taiwan is that then you have to accommodate to Taiwanese audience members' taste, which is, I think, part of the comedian's job. Like, if I tell a joke and it makes most of the people uncomfortable in the room and they're not laughing, that's on me. But that's not, you know, that's not me being canceled. That's not me being censored. That is just me as a comedian having to write better. So the audience feedback is very important. Comedy is not something that I can just sit at home and write and think I'm so funny and then just like lean on that. It always depends on what I get back in the room.
But comedy should be edgy, or at least this is what a lot of comedians say, that comedy should make audience feel a little bit uncomfortable. What do you think, Atsuko?
Oh, I don't know if that's necessarily true. I don't know. I think it can make the audiences think. Comedy could be anything. It could be silly. It could be stupid. It could be the dumbest observation that's like, oh my gosh, that's so true. Comedy, at the end of the day, is connecting with the audience, you know? So even if it's something uncomfortable, it's because you spoke some truth that was funny that then, you know, that maybe that's the edge you're talking about, where it's like, oh my gosh, did you just really say that, you know, you dressed your husband to look like you because you've always wanted a sister, or whatever it is, right? It's uncomfortable. I think a conversation with the audience is what it really is, right? And so, like Vickie said, letting the audience tell you what they're feeling, what they're not feeling, that's very essential. To comedy for the comedians, but also for the audience, because then they're getting authentic comedy and the art of it, you know, without censorship or without rules. Letting them be the rules.
Vickie, how important is it for a comedian to bomb at least once in their career? I've been told also by comedians that this is an experience that every comedian should have, just to kind of see what it looks like.
I definitely think bombing is a very important part of being a comedian. I myself feel like I don't bomb enough. I'm a very self-conscious writer. So when I write, and I think this is part of because I started doing comedy in China, I have this natural instinct to edit myself before I even put anything on stage. So, and that's actually something that I'm trying to undo now. I'm trying to push myself to write more honestly, more provocatively. Now that I don't have to worry about the 3 T's or censorship or submitting my script. But yeah, I think bombing is very humbling, and it proves that you're trying something new. If you're not bombing, it means you're not pushing yourself. You're just leaning on what you know and what's comfortable.
I seem to be a very experienced comedian now with the amount of times I bombed on stage. But I want to go back to talking about censorship. And the U.S. government has institutions, has tools like the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, that often steps in when it comes to content, when it comes to regulating what's okay and what's not okay to be put on TV. Atsuko, do you consider that to be a form of censorship?
Sure, yeah. I mean, technically it is, you know. And so each environment, I think, when there's some comedians, right, in the States that are now more conservative, that are using like censorship and cancel culture as like a weapon against, you know, people who want to do feel good comedy or don't want to punch down on marginalized communities. And so they forget that we've always had censorship of some form, like FCC, or you can't curse on daytime television or whatever. It's just always been a thing. It's always been like this. Yeah, and so there's always been certain rules we have to play around. But for the most part, right, in the U.S., there will be platforms you can always say whatever you want on it. Not always a good thing. I mean, that is how people were able to rush a whole capital. But like, you know, for the most part, there's always whatever you want to say, there'll always be a place you could say it at. That is America.
Yeah, and that's sort of the difference between what the West understands censorship to be and what actually happens in China, right? I think there's a big difference between censoring certain words, like parts of the language, versus censoring entire concepts. Like I have comedian friends from China who told me like, oh, for a few months there, they couldn't talk about Japan. Like the entire concept of Japan was off limits because of some political issue. Like that's a very different situation, very different degree of censorship compared to what's happening in the West. Also, the FCC will give you a fine, but the CCP will actually shut you down. Like House, the comedian you mentioned earlier, was under police investigation because of one joke that leaked that wasn't even published.
Well, I'm very glad that you brought in this distinction, because even if you don't end up in a criminal court for what you say on stage, you may still be convicted in the court of public opinion. This has led to social censorship and the phenomenon known as cancel culture. Formosa Improv Group, or FIG, is a bilingual troupe that puts on monthly shows in Taipei. Brian Cragen followed them as they explored this topic for an upcoming show. Take a look.
Hello? The last 6 years, FIG has been bringing bilingual improv comedy to Taiwan, appealing to both Taiwanese and Western senses of humor.
Sometimes people will do something and someone will say, oh no, am I going to get cancelled? They say, no, you're not successful enough to be cancelled. It requires a certain amount of success.
Cancel culture became a well-known phenomenon in the 2010s. Over the past few years, celebrities across the spectrum, like comedian Louis C.K. and singer Taylor Swift, have been the target of being canceled or boycotted for their actions.
That element of surprise is there, rather than just reading off a script and someone.
But freedom of performance and playing different characters suggested by the audience without a script may leave you faced with sensitive topics. And some, like Fig newcomer Jay, a freelancer in the travel industry who grew up in Taiwan, steer clear from certain topics.
Let me 有一个 topic 我不敢碰，就是 racist， 因为这个是我身为台湾人，我不太知道我什么样的言论才会变成 racist。对，因为这是我的成长背景里面缺乏的。
我永远不会得到我的梦想。
The members of the group come from diverse backgrounds and perform together, switching between English and Mandarin, and, by extension, different cultures. So, what does cancel culture mean to a group that has so many different points of reference?
Personally, I don't think there's a whole lot of difference between quote-unquote cancel culture and regular old criticism. I think that the difference is that social media exists, and when people see the criticism, they can say, "Oh, I agree. I'm also going to not do this," or something like that.
On performance day at 2-3 Comedy, Taipei's premier comedy club, the show was an homage to movies. The first half of the performance was about silent films, and so had less of a chance of offending someone. The second half of the show...
That hurts!
Well, it hurts me too. I've overcooked the pot roast.
Comedy is an art form, and it requires you to be able to express yourself freely. So if you have to be thinking about what you're saying and second-guessing yourself, that really takes the heart out of it.
The performance was well received by the audience, with the actors feeling like they had the freedom to go whichever direction worked. But as they gain more fans, maybe one day they'll be famous enough to worry about being canceled themselves.
Thank you, we're the Rocks!
You can watch the full version of that feature on our YouTube channel and the TaiwanPlus website. Atsuko, how do you understand the term cancel culture in the US and the West? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, like I was saying earlier, it's sort of been weaponized to, for people who have said hurtful things about like the queer community or racist things, to be like, see, you're just censoring. You want comedy to be over? That's sort of the context that I see it as a comedian in the United States. So that's how I understand it. It's not something I fear for me. I think that even if I'm improvising, I improvise all the time on stage. I know the kind of person I am. I know the kind of conversations I have. That girl in that video who said, there's a topic I don't touch, and it's like racism. Good, then don't touch it. If you don't know enough of it or enough about it, you shouldn't touch it because, you don't, just like I'm not a political comedian. I don't talk about politics in comedy. People don't come to me to see what the latest news is. So then I don't touch on it. I'm here to make you feel good, to lift spirits, to make you forget. There's some observational jokes, and then there's some silly, stupid jokes, and some personal life stories you'll get out of me, But yeah, that's how I understand cancel culture here in the States. That was the question, I'm realizing.
It was, yes. Thank you very much for answering it. I think your answer was on point. Vickie, is there cancel culture in Taiwan? Do people get canceled here?
The big one I can think of right now is actually a YouTuber who recently had his account shut down on YouTube because he was talking about pedophilia. But I feel like that's not so much cancel culture. That is actually censorship. You talked about something that was entirely illegal and against very explicit community guidelines, and then you have your account removed. That's just, again, having consequences to your behavior, being held accountable. Yeah, like I still think a lot of what we refer to as cancel culture in Taiwan for now seems to be just people who behaved badly and then suffer roughly appropriate consequences for it. I haven't off the top of my head, I can't think of anyone who was like unduly punished for it. Whereas like if anything, I feel like the real cancel culture happened after the Me Too movement. There were so many women who came forward who were doxxed, who were, terrorized on the internet, who were trolled, and, people were threatening them. Like, that's cancel culture. It's not, a YouTuber or comedian being criticized for something inappropriate or mean that they said. It's oftentimes a lot of vulnerable people who come forward with their truth and then suffering the unjust consequences for it. I guess at the core of it, the term cancel culture is awkwardly defined.
Well, I'm glad you brought in consequences because there is one aspect that might actually make people get canceled in different ways. As you can imagine, not all genders get canceled equally. Comedian and writer Titi Lee told us why women often get the short end of the stick.
Women are just historically more attacked for existing. So if you're existing in media, on TV, on film, on the internet, you're just going to be more used to being scrutinized for what you're saying or doing. Whereas traditionally, I don't think that's the case for all male comedians. And because of that, I think the men have been more vocal about the effects of cancel culture and are a bit more afraid of cancel culture and have created more initiative to, I guess, cancel culture. But ultimately, I think it's just about how you react when you encounter a conflict or controversy for your actions. And I think that women tend to not bounce back as fast because of the same thing, where we are already being scrutinized for everything we do. So one mistake tends to take you out of the running.
You can find the full version of our interview with Titi Lee on our YouTube channel or the TaiwanPlus website. Vickie, do you feel men and women get canceled differently in Taiwan?
Oh, for sure. I think women are definitely held to a higher and more complicated set of standards than men in our society still. When you go to a comedy show in Taipei, it's still overwhelmingly more male performers, and they get away with saying all kinds of things. They talk about masturbation, they talk about casual sex. But when I start talking about, my dating life, I can very distinctly feel resistance in the room. Especially if, for example, my partner is a white male American person, and whenever I bring that up, I can feel the men in the room especially just kind of tightening up, and like their arms start crossing and they start not responding to what I'm saying. I've also gotten messages and emails after shows, always men who are complaining about the content of my comedy, but none of my male counterparts in Taipei have ever gotten anything like that. And maybe part of that is you like the earlier Fig segment said, like you kind of have to be famous enough to be canceled or at least encounter criticism like that. But I guess I also agree with what TT said. As a woman, when I get that kind of feedback, I think, okay, if I'm in a more male-dominated audience, if tonight it's mostly men in the audience, I will adjust my material to make sure I talk about what works. I still make people laugh. As a comedian, my job is to make sure everyone has a good time, not to have a political agenda. At least on stage, anyways.
Atsuko, do you think that getting canceled has become almost a brand for some comedians? I mean, if you go through some comedy specials on Netflix, half of them have titles like "Things I Can't Say on TV," even though I have a comedy special. Is that becoming a branding thing?
I guess so, yeah. It's this weird, sick, like, I'm so proud of it now. I guess you just have to lean in if you find your audience, right? Because then the audience who are stoked about it are the ones that are like also like-minded people. Like, yeah, screw the people who are hurt, I guess. And so you have to lean into that brand, you know? Sometimes if you get canceled, I mean, one of the jokes here is that like if a comedian gets canceled, it's like, oh, we'll see him performing next at the Trump rally. Because, like, where else is he going to perform? Like, usually that is what happens. Like I said, there's a platform for everyone here, you know? And people will always find you. You're not truly ever canceled, you know? Going back to what Vickie said, like, with women, yeah, it's the women who came out against Louis C.K., their careers were canceled. You don't know their names. You've never heard their jokes because they were comedians too. But managers and like Hollywood got involved in making sure these women didn't have a comedy career after they came out about it. Louis C.K. is still touring. He's selling tons of tickets. I think he just did Madison Square Garden again. Wow. And he still makes his specials and you can buy them through his website. You just have to change the platform. Maybe it's not Netflix anymore, but still, like, yeah, I don't think these people are truly ever canceled.
Well, let's hope that people get canceled if that is even a thing for the right reasons. If a comedian is just unfunny, they can just move to Taipei, where apparently you don't need to be. Thank you to both of my very funny guests today, Atsuko Okatsuka in Los Angeles and Vickie Wang, a Taiwanese comedian joining us from Taipei. And for our viewers everywhere, it's been good to have your company. If you've enjoyed today's episode or have anything you would like to add to the dialogue, join the conversation on our social media. And remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay connected.